39%.
Hmm.
That is the number of adults in the United States who, look around at the world today, watch the news, and genuinely believe we are living in the end times.
Yeah, that is a staggering statistic. I mean, it really shows where people's heads are at.
Right. Welcome to Reformed Thinking. We take your articles, theological frameworks, and historical data, and we extract the most vital insights to help you figure out the world. So today we are taking a deep dive into a topic that clearly carries a massive cultural burden.
Oh, for sure. When nearly 4 out of 10 people are walking around with this undeniable existential dread, you start to realize we are dealing with a society that feels like it is hurtling toward a breaking point.
Yeah, and people try to soothe that anxiety, right? They use various secular frameworks.
Exactly. Well, I should say precisely. You see a heavy reliance on the idea of human progress, or the assumption that, like, Darwinian evolution translates into social evolution.
Right, the hope for some kind of global utopianism.
Yeah, the prevailing narrative out there is that humanity is just progressively climbing toward this enlightened state of universal peace.
But then you open the biblical text.
Mhm.
Specifically, you look at the words of Christ, and he delivers this stark declaration that just shatters that utopian illusion completely.
It really does. He states that human history will not culminate in a self-made utopia, but rather in an unparalleled epoch of divine judgment and cosmic tribulation.
And that is the mission of our discussion today. We're going to examine Matthew chapter 24, specifically verses 15 through 28. The goal is to unpack the theological and historical realities of the Great Tribulation and the abomination of desolation.
And we are treating this text not as some speculative puzzle to solve on a whiteboard, but as a severe warning, and honestly an absolute anchor of comfort for the believer.
Yeah, that dual nature of the text is crucial, because you, listening right now, you might feel overwhelmed by the daily barrage of catastrophic news.
Right. But this ancient text offers a really precise, sovereign framework for human history. It demonstrates that the eschatological timeline is not spinning out of control.
No, it rests securely in the hands of the triune God. The future is a matter of divine decree, not some human accident.
So before we look at the horrific events of the tribulation itself, we really need to establish the ground zero of this prophecy.
Yeah, we have to understand where and when Jesus actually delivered these words, and the historical precursors he referenced. Setting the scene really changes how we understand the weight of his words.
The historical context is essential here. We are looking at the Tuesday of Passion Week, so roughly 80, 30, or 33.
Just days before the crucifixion.
Yeah, literally days. Jesus has just delivered a blistering, devastating critique of the apostate religious leaders, which you can read in Matthew chapter 23.
Right, he pronounces all those woes upon the scribes and Pharisees.
Yes. And then he does something highly symbolic. He leaves the temple complex and declares their house desolate.
He actually tells them, "See, your house is left to you desolate." And then he physically walks out.
Which is huge. The departure of Christ from the temple is the theological equivalent of the glory of God departing from Israel back in the Old Testament.
Wow. So he is now seated privately with his disciples on the Mount of Olives. They are looking back across the Kidron Valley at Herod's temple.
And this was a magnificent, gleaming architectural marvel. It was covered in gold and white marble.
Right, and looking right at the center of their religious and cultural universe, Jesus delivers the Olivet Discourse.
The disciples are marveling at the stones, and Jesus tells them that not one stone will be left upon another.
I mean, that statement alone shatters their worldview.
Oh, completely.
Hmm.
And the trigger event for the coming devastation, the actual catalyst for the end of the age, is found in verse 15. He introduces a really specific, terrifying concept to his disciples.
Yeah, the phrase that sets everything into motion is the abomination of desolation. He says, "Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place."
Right.
So, what is the actual theological weight of those words in the original language?
Well, when you look at the Greek phrasing there, the term used for abomination is incredibly severe. It's belugma.
Belugma, okay.
Yeah. And in its Greco-Roman usage and its appearance in the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament, it refers to something really profoundly foul and detestable to the Almighty.
Like almost exclusively denoting idolatry.
Yes, almost exclusively. It is not just a moral failing. It is a literal stench in the nostrils of God. It is the ultimate violation of his holiness.
And then the word for desolation.
That points to the absolute barren devastation that this specific idolatry produces. Idolatry in the holy place strips the life and presence of God from the area, leaving it a total wasteland.
So it is a specific, localized act of anti-worship that brings complete ruin. To the Jewish disciples sitting on that mountain, that phrase would have triggered a massive historical memory. Which brings up a dynamic I was thinking about regarding how biblical prophecy actually functions.
Oh, yeah. Like looking at a mountain range.
Yes. Looking at these prophetic texts is a lot like standing miles away from a massive mountain range. When you look at the peaks from a distance, they look like they are pressed flat against the sky, sitting right next to each other.
Right, but what the viewer cannot see from that vantage point is the massive, sprawling valley of time and distance between those peaks.
Yeah. That analogy perfectly describes the concept of prophetic telescoping.
The biblical prophets, and Jesus himself here utilizing the book of Daniel, point to historical shadows that act as precursors, but they are looking past those shadows to a distant, final peak.
Right. For instance, the first historical peak or shadow that the disciples would immediately think of is the Syrian king Antiochus Epiphanes.
Yeah, back in 167 D.C., Antiochus brutally desecrated the Jewish temple.
He sacrificed a pig on the sacred altar and erected a statue of Zeus.
Which is a literal historical abomination causing desolation. The original Jewish audience would have shuddered just remembering the stories of that event.
Antiochus is the historical prototype, but Jesus is pointing past him, stating that the fulfillment of Daniel's prophecy is still in the future.
Now, another peak in that prophetic mountain range is the Roman destruction of the temple in AD 70 under the General Titus.
The Roman legions besieged Jerusalem, slaughtered its inhabitants, and burned the temple to the ground. They completely dismantled the sacrificial system.
Right. And here is where the theological rubber meets the road. There is a viewpoint out there known as preterism.
Okay, let's unpack that.
Preterism argues that these prophecies in Matthew 24 were exhaustively and entirely fulfilled in that AD 70 destruction by the Romans.
But looking through a strict dispensational framework, AD 70 is just another shadow. It was another peak in the foreground, not the final destination.
Yeah. The reason a robust dispensational theology rejects preterism is that the cosmic magnitude of the events described later in this discourse simply did not occur in AD 70.
Because Jesus speaks of an unparalleled global tribulation, astronomical signs, and his own physical return flashing like lightning across the sky.
Right. Titus destroying the temple was horrific, but it did not culminate in the physical return of the conquering Christ.
So the framework we are examining insists on a strict distinction between God's dealing with national Israel and his dealing with the church.
Yes. This perspective places these specific, terrifying events in the future in a period known as the 70th week of Daniel, or, the time of Jacob's trouble.
And this period of wrath is directed specifically at ethnic Israel and the unbelieving world.
Correct. Prior to this, according to the pre-tribulational view we're looking at, the church will have been raptured. The church is not the target of this specific outpouring of divine wrath.
That redemptive historical distinction elevates the sovereign orchestration of history. God is not reacting on the fly. He deals with Israel according to his specific covenantal promises, and he deals with the church according to his specific covenantal promises.
Now, since the trigger event, this future abomination of desolation, is a recognizable, objective desecration of a rebuilt temple, the immediate consequence for those who witness it is going to be absolute, frantic panic.
The sign is clear, so the response has to be immediate. Let's look at the specific instructions Christ gives for the moment that idol is erected.
The language Jesus utilizes in verses 16 through 20 is really a grammatical barrage of panic.
A barrage of panic. I like that phrasing.
Yeah, he employs a series of rapid-fire, third-person imperatives in the Greek. The verbs in the original text are just abrupt and forceful. They do not suggest a casual departure or some sort of strategic retreat.
So it's not a situation where you call a moving company and pack your boxes.
Not at all. These verbs demand a desperate, continuous, immediate escape. Jesus maps out the geographical and situational specifics with intense precision.
He states that those in Judea must flee to the mountains immediately.
Right. And he gets incredibly specific about everyday life in the first century. He says the man on the housetop should not go down into his house to grab his belongings.
The worker out in the field should not turn back to grab his cloak. Now, I want to push back on this a little bit, or at least look at the underlying psychology here.
Sure.
Why the intense focus on minor material goods like a winter coat? If you are facing the threat of a global antichrist and an unprecedented desecration, isn't that bigger than someone's wardrobe? Why mention the cloak?
That detail exposes the human condition perfectly. The exegetical reality is that the material goods themselves are not the primary issue.
Okay.
The issue is that in this specific moment on the divine timeline, any delay becomes an act of disobedience and a fatal error.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. The possessions represent familiar earthly attachments. In a moment of sudden crisis, human beings default to normalcy bias. They want to gather their things to feel secure.
That makes total sense.
Jesus is saying the danger is so sudden and catastrophic that going back for a coat demonstrates a fatal failure to understand the urgency of the hour. That attachment will result in literal death.
It forces the individual to recognize the absolute worthlessness of earthly wealth when judgment falls. Your bank account, your possessions, your extra coat, they cannot shield you from what is coming.
No, they can't.
But amid all this terrifying, breathless urgency, there's a striking moment of compassion from Christ. He pronounces a lament for pregnant women and nursing mothers.
Yeah. He is fully aware of the physical toll and the sheer agony this frantic flight will demand of the vulnerable. He knows the physical limitations of humanity.
He understands the burden of carrying a child while fleeing into the mountains.
And he follows that deep compassion with a command to pray. He instructs them to pray that their flight does not happen in winter, when the freezing weather would make survival nearly impossible.
Or on a Sabbath, when strict travel restrictions and closed gates would hinder their escape.
You're right.
That introduces a fascinating theological paradox that we need to unpack. God completely ordains the future. The events of the end times are fixed by divine decree. Yet Christ commands his people to pray about the circumstances of those events, praying that it does not happen in winter. How does prayer function in a universe where the future is already written?
This touches the very core of Reformed systematic theology. Providence does not cancel human action or prayer.
It establishes them.
Exactly. God sovereignly ordains the ends, the final outcomes, but he also ordains the means by which those outcomes are achieved. He decrees that his people will be preserved, and part of the ordained mechanism for their preservation is their obedient prayer.
So prayer is not an attempt to change God's mind.
No, it is the appointed means of grace by which God accomplishes his sovereign will on earth.
So the necessity of abandoning everything, running to the mountains without a single moment's hesitation, forces a very heavy question.
Which is?
Just how bad is this coming distress? Why is the panic so absolute that you cannot even grab a coat? This leads directly into the theological epicenter of the entire Olivet Discourse.
Verse 21 provides the sobering answer. Jesus states, "For then there will be a great tribulation, such as has not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever will."
He is establishing the definitive metric of human agony.
He really is. He says it is entirely unequaled.
When you think about the horrors of human history, the Holocaust, the killing fields of Cambodia, the bubonic plague, the destruction of Jerusalem, Christ is stating that this future period will eclipse all of them combined.
It is a sweeping declaration of unmitigated suffering. He is drawing a boundary around the horror. It is the absolute, undisputed peak of historical distress.
But right when the text reaches its darkest, most terrifying point, we encounter what can only be described as the bedrock of Reformed theology regarding the sovereignty of God in salvation.
Yeah, verse 22 is the critical pivot of the passage. Christ says, "Unless those days have been cut short, no life would have been saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short."
That verse is a direct reflection of the theology found in the Westminster Confession of Faith.
Specifically, chapter 3.
Right, which declares that God from all eternity did, by the most wise and holy counsel of his own will, freely and unchangeably ordain whatsoever comes to pass.
This text in Matthew proves that God's eternal decree dictates the actual, literal calendar of suffering.
The implication is terrifying. If the days were not forcefully amputated by divine decree, the Antichrist and the outpouring of wrath would literally annihilate all flesh on the planet.
Human survival is entirely dependent on God stepping in. And the text explicitly uses this reality to dismantle theological frameworks that elevate human ability, like Arminianism.
Yeah, let's talk about that. Arminian theology generally tends to elevate human autonomy and free will over divine sovereignty.
It leans heavily on the idea that human choice is the deciding factor in salvation and perseverance. But the preservation of the saints in this passage rests entirely upon God acting unilaterally.
The text says it happens for the sake of the elect.
Right. The elect are those chosen by God before the foundation of the world. Their survival in the tribulation does not depend on their own cleverness or their survival skills or their free will to endure.
It depends entirely on God shortening the days.
Yes.
I was trying to visualize this concept of horrific suffering being bounded by a sovereign decree. It is like a parent who allows a necessary, life-saving medical procedure for a child.
Oh, that's a good way to look at it.
The parent knows the surgery will cause immense pain, and the child will suffer terribly during the recovery process. But the parent strictly dictates to the surgeon exactly when to stop,
Right.
setting the absolute boundaries of the procedure so that the child survives and heals. The suffering the child experiences is very real and it is agonizing, but the suffering is never sovereign.
Only the parent overseeing the procedure is sovereign over the outcome.
Right.
That analogy captures the dynamic perfectly. The tribulation is severe beyond comprehension, but it is never autonomous. The Antichrist is not sovereign, the distress is not sovereign, only God is sovereign.
He measures the precise duration.
Yeah, he measures the precise duration of the wrath, specifically to ensure that his chosen people are not consumed by it. He holds the stopwatch.
Extreme physical suffering almost always breeds desperate spiritual vulnerability. When people are starving, when they are terrified, when society is collapsing around them, they look for saviors.
They want a way out.
And that psychological reality sets the stage for the next massive peril in the text, which is spiritual deception.
In verses 23 through 26, Jesus shifts the focus from physical flight to spiritual discernment. The nature of the commands changes entirely.
Earlier, the command was to flee to the mountains. Now the commands become prohibitive warnings. Do not believe it.
He warns that false Christs and false prophets will arrive on the scene, and they are not just going to have persuasive arguments or charismatic personalities.
No, he says they're going to perform great signs and wonders. They're bringing supernatural spectacles to back up their claims.
This is a critical juncture in the theological analysis. The framework we are examining takes a firm cessationist stance.
Right. Cessationism being the theological view that the miraculous gifts of the apostolic era, things like speaking in tongues, predictive prophecy, and apostolic physical healings, ceased with the death of the original apostles and the closing of the biblical canon.
So if we operate from that cessationist framework, meaning God is no longer dispensing the gift of miracles to individuals, what are these great signs and wonders that are happening during the tribulation?
How are they performing them?
Well, according to this perspective, these signs are explicitly demonic counterfeits.
Wow.
They are supernatural in nature, but their origin is satanic. They are designed specifically by the enemy to deceive.
They imitate messianic hope, they mimic biblical miracles, and they exploit the sheer terror of the population to draw people away from the truth.
And looking at this through our theological lens, this provides a very strict critique of modern charismatic and continuationist movements, as well as seeker-sensitive pragmatism and the prosperity gospel.
Right. Now, just to be clear to you, the listener, we are just imparting what the source material argues here. We aren't picking political or denominational sides. But the argument presented is that these modern movements dangerously condition the church.
Yeah, they condition people to accept subjective emotional experiences and pragmatic spectacle over the objective truth of the written word.
The danger is one of conditioning.
Exactly. If a church trains its people to chase after signs, wonders, emotional highs, and physical healings today, relying on personal experience rather than the closed canon of Scripture, they are priming the pump for ultimate deception.
The demand for visible signs in the modern era is seen as a dangerous precursor to accepting the demonic deception of the Antichrist.
If your faith requires a miracle to sustain it, you will eventually follow whoever performs the biggest miracle.
I have to ask about the mechanics of this deception, though. Jesus says the deception will be so good, so convincing with these massive supernatural signs that it could trick the elect, if that were possible.
Yeah.
How is anyone supposed to resist it? If you are starving in the wilderness and a man calls fire down from the sky and offers you bread, how do you fight something that looks identically like a genuine miracle?
Jesus provides the defense mechanism right in the text. He says in verse 25, "Behold, I have told you in advance."
I have told you in advance.
Yes. The defense against future deception is prior, objective revelation. The written word of Christ must judge the visual sign. The visual sign must never be allowed to judge the written word.
That is a crucial distinction for the believer. The miracle does not validate the message. The written word validates the source of the miracle.
Exactly. If a prophet calls fire from the sky, heals the sick, or stops a war, but contradicts the previously revealed scripture, he is a false prophet.
The elect are protected not because they possess a higher IQ or better natural intuition than the rest of the world. They are protected because Christ has anchored them in his prior warning.
His word holds them fast when their eyes tell them a lie.
By warning the elect about these secret, hidden Messiahs, people whispering, "He is in the wilderness," or "He is in the inner rooms," Jesus creates a natural, striking contrast.
Right.
If the false Christs operate in secret, utilizing localized spectacles and cult-like isolation, how will we recognize the true king when he actually returns?
Well, we move to verse 27, which provides the dazzling certainty of the true Christ. Jesus describes the parousia, his physical coming. He compares his return to lightning coming from the east and flashing all the way to the west.
That vivid imagery absolutely demolishes any concept of a secret second coming.
It leaves no room for ambiguity at all. This text directly refutes the teachings of groups like the Jehovah's Witnesses, who claim that Christ returned invisibly or spiritually in 1914.
Right. Lightning is sudden, it is universally visible, and it is entirely undeniable. You do not need an insider to tell you that lightning just flashed across the sky.
You experience it. The true return of Christ will not require coded announcements on the internet, secret gatherings in the desert, or hidden chambers. Every eye will see him.
And then we hit verse 28, which contains a stark, almost jarring final metaphor. Jesus says, "Wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather."
Yeah.
That is an incredibly grim way for Jesus to describe his own victorious return. Why use scavenger birds? It feels almost morbid when discussing the King of Kings.
It is a shocking image to Western ears, but we have to unpack the underlying meaning. The Greek word used for corpse, tuma, indicates a fallen, rotting body.
Okay.
This phrasing indicates that the true Christ does not return merely, just to execute a rescue mission for the saints.
He returns to enact a judicial execution upon the wicked.
Yes, a judicial execution. He is coming to wage war.
A morally putrid, apostate world inevitably attracts the swift, scavenging birds of divine judgment.
The return is a majestic yet utterly terrifying display of Christ as the conquering king. He is not returning as the suffering servant. He is returning as the righteous judge.
This imagery aligns perfectly with Daniel chapter 7 and Revelation 19. He is coming to violently eradicate rebellion from the earth.
Where spiritual corruption ripens and rots, divine judgment surely comes to clean it up. The appearing of Christ exposes death and condemns apostasy.
It is the ultimate vindication of his holiness. The gathering of the vultures signifies that the judgment will be swift, thorough, and inescapable for those who have aligned themselves with the Antichrist system.
Exactly.
So we have traversed a massive, terrifying prophetic landscape today. Let's shift the focus to you, the listener.
Right, the application.
If we hold to the pre-tribulational view presented in this framework, the true church will not be present on earth to endure this specific future tribulation. They will have been raptured prior to the Antichrist's reign.
Yes.
So how does an ancient, terrifying prophecy about a time you will not even be here for dictate the way you live your life this coming week?
Huh.
What is the practical, daily application of knowing this?
The application is actually quite direct. The first major takeaway is the necessity of radical discernment and separation.
Because if you know that human history is culminating in divine judgment, rather than human perfection, you must reject secular ideologies that promise to fix the world through human effort.
Right. Looking at modern cultural issues through this theological lens provides a very specific grid.
And again, impartially reporting the source material here. But from this perspective, movements like critical race theory, pluralism, and various secular social justice initiatives are viewed as attempts to build an earthly utopia without the returning king.
They are inherently human-centered solutions. They operate on the assumption that if we just educate people enough, or redistribute resources perfectly, or pare down the right structures, we can achieve peace and equity.
But the Olivet Discourse argues that these ideologies offer false, humanistic utopias that directly contradict Christ's guarantee.
The world is heading toward a climax of divine judgment, not social perfection achieved by political activism.
This lens also applies that same strict discernment to religious unity. It highlights the necessity of rejecting ecumenical unity with systems that deviate from the biblical gospel.
From a Reformed perspective, attempting to build spiritual alliances with Roman Catholicism or Mormonism for the sake of cultural influence is dangerous.
Because it compromises the exclusive truth of justification by faith alone.
The theological principle established here is that fidelity to the Word of God requires firm boundaries. If the world system is headed for ultimate judgment, the church must separate from any system whether it is a political ideology or a religious institution, that offers a counterfeit hope or a counterfeit gospel.
Which brings in a very helpful concept from Reformed theology, the third use of the law.
Oh, yeah.
This is the idea that the commands of God guide believers in grateful obedience, showing us how to live in a way that pleases Him.
If you look at the lifestyle implications of the commands Jesus gave, fleeing without grabbing a coat, abandoning the field without looking back, there is a massive application for how we view our possessions today.
The theologian J.I. Packer wrote extensively about this. He noted that believers must live with the mindset of pilgrims. We are passing through.
That is the core of it. If those fleeing the Antichrist cannot stop for a split second to grab a winter coat, building a modern life around the endless accumulation of wealth, status, and earthly comfort is sheer folly.
It is a terrifying reality check on Western materialism. You have to ask yourself honestly, what earthly possession, what career goal, what financial safety net would slow down your obedience to Christ today?
It exposes the hidden idols of the heart. We tend to build our castles in a world that is scheduled for demolition.
Right. But alongside that severe warning against materialism, the text offers immense theological comfort.
Your salvation, your preservation through the trials of this life, does not depend on your fragile, inconsistent grip on God. It depends entirely on God's omnipotent grip on you.
That is the doctrine of election applied to your everyday Tuesday. If God sovereignly bounds the greatest tribulation in human history, literally altering the calendar of the apocalypse just to preserve His elect, He is more than capable of holding on to you through whatever personal crisis you are facing right now.
It obliterates anxiety regarding the future.
The future is not a chaotic void governed by chance or political machinations. It is a measured, scheduled reality governed by a sovereign king who knows His people by name,
Absolutely.
synthesizing everything we have unpacked today. This text in Matthew 24 destroys the persistent illusion of human progress. It exposes the deadly, fatal nature of earthly attachments and spiritual deception.
But above all, it proves that history is hurtling toward a climax managed entirely by the decree of the triune God.
The King is coming, and His word is the only safe refuge. Which leaves us with a final concept to mull over as you go about your week.
Yeah, think about this.
If the most terrifying, unprecedented days of global tribulation are already measured, scheduled, and bounded by God's sovereign mercy for His people, how does that reality reframe the minor, everyday anxieties that consume your current thoughts? Thank you for listening to Reformed Thinking.